Before I begin, I'll just say a word of prayer, so if you go, just bow your heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this day. Thank you so much for the blessing of this church, and thank you for this opportunity that I can share with your people. May I share not from my perspective or what I need to share, but what you need to share, Lord. May it be something that we can take from. May it be beneficial to us and help us to grow stronger in you each day. Lord, please be with me as I share. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I want to start off this morning with a short story. So try and relax and try and imagine what's going on in your head. There was once a famine in a land. The fields were parched and brown from the lack of rain, and the crops lay sweltering from thirst. People were anxious and irritable as they searched the sky for any sign of relief. Days turned into arid weeks, and no rain came. And so the ministers of the local church called for an hour of prayer on the townspeople. And so the following Sabbath, all the people across different faiths, across different cultures, they came together to pray for God in hopes of rain. Amidst the people gathering for prayer, there was a young girl holding in her hands a big umbrella. And as the crowd noticed this, they could not help but wonder, and some were curious, and others were annoyed because they were kept getting poked by the spokes of the umbrella. Finally, someone asks, "Why did you bring an umbrella? Can't you see that there is no rain, and we have come here to pray for rain?" The girl replied, "Yes, indeed. I came to pray too. And I am so certain that our prayers will be answered and that it will rain. That is why I brought this big, colourful umbrella." And when that hour ended, as if on a magical command, a soft rain began to fall, and the young girl was delighted. My question to you this morning is your faith that you have with God like the young girl with the umbrella? Is your faith one step ahead? Now this morning we're going to be looking at the well-known passage in the Bible. If you can't guess by the title of the sermon, we're going to be looking at Elijah on Mount Carmel. And in preparing the sermon, I was wondering what angle I should approach this story. Should it be with the theme of God's love, or with his mercy or his justice, or maybe his power and authority? Because all these aspects are very present. But in the end, I chose to have us focus on the faith. Because without the faith, this story never could have happened. And of course, the title of the sermon, "How Long Will You Waver?" is this iconic line that Elijah delivers, revolving around how we should have a strong faith that's not wavering in God. We're going to be reading 1 Kings chapter 18. We're going to be reading from verse 17 until 39. And at each couple verses, we're going to reflect and try and go deep into what the word tells us. And you know, one thing I love studying about the Bible is that there's no limit to how far we can learn. Getting up here as a YPW with barely any sermon experience, I thought this story was pretty difficult to get something new because of how well known it is, and especially preaching to a congregation that is older than myself. But as I've been preparing the sermon and reading this passage of Elijah, which is so prominent and well known, each time I somehow learned something new. And so I encourage you guys to do the same as we follow along. And to give some brief context before we start reading, at this time of history, the Israelites were a new generation of people, a generation who had forgotten God's strength, forgotten their history of bringing out of Egypt, and even the story of David and Goliath was 150 years ago. In fact, at this time, the nation of Israel knew two gods. They knew Baal, the god of rain and wind and fertility, and goddess of Asherah, who was motherhood and creation, both which were brought by influence from Canaan. And so God wanted to deliver this message to the nation of Israel that they had fallen away from God. And in order just to get Israel's attention, God would send a drought for the next 3 years. Now, I don't know about you, but the nation of Israel must have been so corrupt and so far away from God for God to send no rain for 3 years. Imagine if for the last 3 years we didn't have any rain. If I were Israel, I would have tried so hard to bring things back to God as soon as possible. But we see that even with this natural disaster, the nation's attention was still not on God. And we might think that this might be a punishment from God, but it's also important to know that God notices his nation falling away, and he steps in. Had he not stepped in, the nation would have completely lost their relationship with Yahweh, the one true God. And I often think, if Israel had believed in God, God would not have demonstrated this power that we're about to see. And so this story portrays that even to a scale to a nation, it's sometimes better to hit rock bottom and then grow stronger with God. So please read with me as we start reading 1 Kings chapter 18, and we're going to start from verse 17. This is King Ahab speaking to Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, O troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel. Bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." We see here Elijah prepares a time and a place that will proceed to become a powerful illustration of God. And it's interesting to see the two perspectives in this room. We have Ahab's perspective on this challenge. It's more of a confrontation between Yahweh and Baal to see which God is stronger, which God will answer through fire. But I like Elijah's perspective more, where he's challenging the nation to stop wavering and to choose God. You see, already, perhaps Elijah's faith is one step ahead because he knows that his God will answer and Baal won't. And in the way Elijah speaks so confidently to the king of Israel, we see his faith is strong and dependent. And that is what God needs. Verse 20 says, "So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, 'How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him.' And the people said nothing." Try and imagine this scene. Elijah standing on Mount Carmel, a prominent mountain which can be seen from all directions of the land. You can picture this scene where Elijah is calling on the nation to choose. Maybe there's hundreds, no, thousands of people, and as he finishes his sentence, you just hear silence. How do you think Elijah felt in that moment? Do you think Elijah doubted in that moment? I mean, peer pressure did exist. The Bible's not specific on Elijah's emotions here, but instead of doubting, perhaps Elijah felt pity for the nation. Perhaps that he knew that many of these people, their beliefs would change soon. And of course, this question he asks everyone, "How long will you waver between two opinions?" It's not just for the Israelites, it's for everyone alive today. We're about to see this sacrifice that's about to be set. They're going to be two bulls that are placed on wood. And now, back then, to get some context, bulls were the biggest sacrifice, biggest animal that you could sacrifice. And so you would have had to sacrifice a lot of wealth and economic power It also demonstrated strength because of how useful they would be in farming. And I love this reflection that we see, because in Numbers 23, verse 22, the ox is used to describe the strength of God that brings Israel out of Egypt. And so we're about to see this parallel, but in a very different situation. Let's keep going at verse 22. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. All the people said, what you say is good. And Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. In that last verse, in verse 25, Elijah ensures to prove God in a way that there is no excuse on his behalf. When Elijah says to the prophets of Baal, choose one bull, he gives the prophets of Baal a choice. Perhaps people would be more skeptical and think that Elijah tricked them if he chose first. This advantage of choosing the bull is given to the prophets of Baal. And you can just imagine the prophets of Baal discussing amongst themselves, which bull do you think looks drier? Which bull do you think looks more flammable? And I'll have to admit something. Hopefully I'm not the only one guilty. As I read this story and this character of Baal appears throughout the text, I have imagined Baal to be some sort of thing in the sky, and as Elijah mentions later on, perhaps Baal is sleeping and he's trying to be woken up by these prophets. But I think it's worth mentioning, and to state it here, that Baal doesn't exist. For these prophets, Baal is just a figment of their imagination. It was a projection of their corruption in sin. In fact, God was not challenging anyone that day, nor did he prove the powers of Baal to be weaker than his, because Baal doesn't exist. He never did exist, and he will never exist in the future. In their minds, though, Baal was the god of the sky. In fact, if you look at ancient illustrations, Baal is often depicted as holding a lightning rod. For them, if anyone could bring down lightning from heaven, it would be Baal. They were so confident, not only confident in their belief, but confident because there was 450 like-minded people against one. Verse 26 says, so they took the bull given to them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. They danced around the altar that they had made. Verse 27, and at noon Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. Midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered. No one paid attention. This might be a thought that you haven't come across, perhaps. But can you see how much faith these prophets had towards Baal? They prayed from morning until midday, and I can only assume these prayers were full of faith, full of conviction, and a desire to prove Elijah wrong. I mean, has anyone else here prayed from morning to midday? That's at least 3 hours or so. And yet, there was no voice. No one paid attention. In verse 27, Elijah mocked them and I love how human he is in doing so. You can just imagine Elijah laughing at them from the other altar because it was just getting ridiculous. He couldn't stop himself from commenting on their evidently wrong beliefs, on their foolishness. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't think mocking people is always the best answer, but when Elijah's mocking these prophets, his intent was not to downgrade the prophets, but to prove something. How often do we see something we don't know that doesn't work for the best of us? We see something that perhaps we know is wrong, but we don't acknowledge it. We may even step foot in it. And a lesson I want to bring out here is perhaps we don't acknowledge some bad influences in our lives because other people do it. If other people do it, it's more okay if you do it, this idea of peer pressure. But going back to the Bible, Elijah was by himself against 450 prophets of Baal. When Elijah has this courage to mock these prophets, he does it to illustrate that it's getting absurd, that their point is already proven. These prophets, they were jumping, they were leaping, they were cutting themselves around a dead bull that they were trying to wake up a non-existent God who had terrible ideologies. Elijah had every right to mock them in this situation. I don't believe that we should go around making fun of people with the intent of hurting, but when we stand up for things that are based on God's truth and reality, what more of a right can you have? Elijah knew the hearts of these prophets, that they would just keep going around the altar, blindly following the one in front. Now, personally, if I was one of the prophets of Baal, the moment Elijah starts mocking me, I would have quit. Because I like to imagine it like a game of sport. Maybe we're playing soccer and you're trying to score as hard as you can, your whole team is trying, but you keep losing. And in the end, your team loses. In that moment, the worst feeling it is to have would surely be if the opposing team started to mock you. And I'm sure that's how the prophets of Baal felt too. You see, whether you believe in God or you believe in something else, everyone has a faith. These prophets, they jumped and leaped, danced to get Baal's attention, but Baal never existed. They had the faith, but it wasn't directed to the one true God in heaven who exists, so there was no voice, let alone an answer of fire. You see, they had the right attitude in trying to seek God, but it was not directed to God. As much as we don't want to associate ourselves with these prophets of Baal, I guarantee you though, we have all experienced this. We have a faith. You may be energetic in your prayer life, in your worship. You may be energetic in your involvement in this church. But if it's not dedicated to God who exists, what good is it? The problem is not here how much faith, but rather where is our faith directed? It is not the long prayers that make prayer effective. It's not the energetic prayers that make prayer effective, although they can be good. Fundamentally, it is that we're praying to a real God in heaven that makes prayer effective. We have a faith, but what matters is where we put it. Now, the next part of the story is where God does answer in a dramatic pillar of fire, in case you didn't know. And we'll read that in a second, but before we get to that, I want to make something clear. You see, God had no obligation to answer Elijah. Even though Elijah's a prophet, that there's a promise that God kept between Elijah, there's no contract saying that God must work whenever Elijah prays. In fact, God could have given up on the nation of Israel and gone elsewhere. God actually has no obligation to answer to anyone, to prove himself that he exists to anyone. I mean, he is all-powerful, he is all-knowing. There's no need to, from his perspective. So, why does he do it? God proves himself to us because he wants us to benefit and have a better faith in him for our sake. You see, you could go and buy a lottery ticket and pray to God with a true faith, earnestly saying, if you are God, prove it by letting me win the million. You could do it in a selfless way and pray to God earnestly, prove it by healing my neighbor. And this is often what I think of people who don't believe in God because they say there is no proof. But our faith, it cannot always be coming from God, obliging to show himself in front of your face. For me, God's love, his infinite blessings that we take for granted, and his word that gives us hope, that is the proof that I need. God does not always answer the way we expect, nor does he answer our demands in the way we may believe is right. And I want to illustrate this. Here's a rectangle, pretty easy to understand, and I think I want it to symbolize every possible thing there is to know about God. I did this with our teen small group, much of them who were right behind me, and I asked them this question: out of this rectangle, what percentage of the rectangle do we as humans understand about God? How much of the rectangle should be shaded in that represents our understanding of God now? Some people said 30%, some said 10%, and then Joel came up on the whiteboard and he drew a tiny little dot in the middle of the rectangle, and he said, and then someone said, that's inaccurate because God's infinitely more powerful than we are. And I suppose this is a way to humble ourselves. Of course, everyone wants that Elijah experience where something amazing happens right in front of our eyes, like a miracle. We might even see other people go through that, and we think to God, why not me? But let me say something. Don't get confused about God having to prove himself to us with God working within us, because there is no argument in questioning God's actions. God is infinitely more powerful than we are. However, in the moments that God does answer, especially with power and authority, like this story, it is for the best reason, because his timing is perfect. Let us keep reading at verse 30. Elijah said to all of the people, "Come here to me." They came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. You can see the contrast from the verse before that says no one paid attention, and you can visualize the people of Israel coming together a little bit more. Maybe they had lost their faith in Baal, and for the past couple hours they had been bored. They were ready for God, and Elijah tells them to come closer, that this is a sight that they don't want to miss. Let's read 31. 31 says, Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had said, "Come," saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. For the first time in a while, an altar from the nation of Israel is dedicated, not to an idol, but to the one true God. And this way, God has this way to come to his people, a way to prove himself without being ignored. And we see here Elijah brings Israel back to their origin. Now, at this stage in history, the 12 tribes were divided. There were 10 tribes of Israel and then the 2 tribes of Judah underneath. But there was no division in God's eyes. Elijah sets 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel because together they are God's people. Verse 33 says, he arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. And then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood. "Do it again," he said, and they did it again. "Do it a third time," he ordered, and they did it the third time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. Now, quick question. Has anyone here tried to light fire using wet wood? I remember it was raining on a Pathfinder camp, and we tried to light this fire, but it's just impossible. And again, just like before, we see Elijah put so much effort into making sure that there's no excuse for the people of Israel. And I'm going to assume that this water had come from the sea or some land that is not within Israel, because there's already so much courage to ask people for 12 pots full of water, even though there was no water for 3 years. The prophets of Baal perhaps chose the most dry bull, the most flammable looking, if that's even possible. These prophets perhaps would refuse to stop shouting and dancing from morning until noon because they thought Baal hadn't noticed. Elijah says no. He says, make it impossible that it can catch fire mistakenly. He says, embrace your understanding that fire and water don't mix, because he knows that God is bigger than that. Elijah says, make sure it cannot be explained scientifically. Soak the bull, soak the wood, soak the stone. Make it impossible unless the power of God intervenes. He proves his faith here. He proves that everything is trusted on God. Let's read from 36. 36 says, at the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant and have done all things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so that these people will know, Lord, that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. Here is Elijah's prayer that was so beautifully read out before. Thank you. Notice that Elijah doesn't say, let it be known that you are God and you will smiteth them, take revenge on them. There is no revenge here taking place, although from the power of God we can see that it's definitely possible. I love that in perhaps one of the most dramatic, epic events in the Bible, God's power is still intended to turn his people's hearts back to him. God can only use a prayer as sincere as Elijah's. Verse 38 says, then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. Verse 39 says, and the people saw this, and they fell prostrate and cried, the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God. Try and picture this fire from heaven. The fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice. Imagine being in the midst of that crowd, where the entire morning was filled with quietness except for the screams of the prophets of Baal. The Bible doesn't illustrate what this fire from heaven looks like, but whether it was a large pillar of fire or maybe something similar to a lightning strike. But what I do know is it came straight from the power of God, so it must have been a spectacle. For me, I imagine this scene like a pure beam of fire starts in the sky, and before long it just absorbs the sacrifice. Whatever way you like to imagine it, we see that the power of God is revealed here. And we see that the natural state of the people is to fall on their face and cry out, Lord, he is God. Elijah, who is in the midst of this, I don't believe Elijah was surprised in this situation. I don't think he was shocked at the fact that God came down and answered his prayer immediately. Perhaps he was shocked at the fact that God burnt up the entire offering. I don't think Elijah was surprised, because when we're surprised in God's victory, it shows that we doubted. And if we doubt, he cannot use all of us to accomplish his will. Elijah's faith was so strong. In that moment on Mount Carmel, there was no risk attached to his decision. He knew that the prophets of Baal were worshipping a non-existent God, and he knew the God of Yahweh, the one true God, was real and all-powerful, and he knew that God's will was to change the hearts of his people. The goal was between Elijah and God, and it was the same. There was no risk. What a faith to have. And when God shows himself, people believe. Now when Elijah would ask, "Who is the real God?" surely all of Israel would answer Yahweh, right? But let me say this. Even in the midst of God proving himself in the most dramatic, spine-chilling miracles, there will always be a few. There will always be a few that are still skeptical in the existence of God. Perhaps someone in the crowd that day would think that was lightning that came from no clouds. I don't know. Maybe someone would say, maybe the water that was poured on the altar was actually petrol, and Elijah lit a fire underneath while no one was watching. You see, we can go excuse after excuse to replace the power and existence of God, but do you know who we become if we do that? We become like the prophets of Baal. They had the faith, but it wasn't directed to God. God could give us the greatest spectacle you could ever see in the world, and some people will call it a scientific miracle. God could give us infinite blessings each day, and some people will say that's just how the world is. God could die on the cross and save our sins. He could do everything he possibly can, only for some people to confine it as a simple historical event. I pray that we view our lives with a clear sight that Yahweh, the one true God in heaven, is trying to work within you. This was never the story about Elijah, for James 5:17 says, Elijah was just a human being, just like you and me. This was never about seeing which God is better in strength. This was not about proving the extinction of Baal, because Baal never existed in the first place. And I'll even go on to say that the main point for God to show his power and strength in one of the most dramatic ways recorded in the Bible. Fundamentally, the story of God's victory on Mount Carmel was to change his people's hearts back to him. The prophets of Baal, they cut themselves until blood was gushing out in hopes that they could get their God's attention. But the real God in heaven died on a cross until his blood was gushing out so that he could save you and me. And so, in the same way that Elijah asked his people all those years ago, I ask you today, how long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him.